Welcome to another edition of A Good Show. On this episode of A Good Show, we have with us Mr. Michael Myles of Inspire Training, Cayman. Welcome back to the show, Michael.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's good to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you back.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Now, we as a society have been discussing the issue of crime as a result of the Bush Stadium incident back in February. But this is not a situation that is new to us. As a matter of fact, we've been wrestling with this issue for decades. And so has Mr. Myles, who has, over the decades, been trying to arrest juvenile delinquency and criminal behavior. Michael, let me tell you thanks, not just for myself, but as a member of the Christian community.
Sure.
Let me tell you thanks for your investment in youth in Cayman.
Yes.
For persevering, for taking whatever steps you needed to take in order so that you could keep on trying to arrest, as I call it, arrest juvenile delinquency. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.
Now, joining us in a conversation also, as you know, is Pastor Ellen Peguero. And Pastor Ellen, I think you're also going to speak on religious participation and requirements. And perhaps some of where the church has failed in leadership in the country as far as the criminal issue is concerned.
Yeah, I think that as a Christian, personally, I think first we got to recognize who the church is. And the church is made up of individuals. And if every one of us would take that role and go out there individually, because sometimes when we talk about the church intervening, we're talking about the church, but we're not identifying who the church is.
You're right.
And we are the church, and we have been commanded by God that we are to look out for the fatherless, the widows, the downcast, the single parents. We have been commissioned to go do that. So yes, and it's all together. We play the role of making a better society for all.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And one of the reports that we're going to use today is the Yolanda Forde report. We're going to use that as a springboard for commentary going forward. A lot of you are familiar or may be familiar with the report or have heard of the Yolanda Forde report, which is actually not the first report addressing crime in the country. The first report was in 2001, and it was the inquiry into the causes of social breakdown and violence among youth in the Cayman Islands. That was in 2001, which then in 2006 was followed up by predisposing factors of criminality in the Cayman Islands, which is written by Ms. Yolanda Forde and is simply referred to as the Yolanda Forde report. Michael, if you don't mind, I would just like to share some with the country about some of the areas that was looked at in that report, and then just quickly excerpt from some of the conclusions therein. So some of the topics and some of the areas of research in the Yolanda Forde report was about community and organizational involvement, religious participation, education and school experiences, criminal profiling at family background, and then she went on to make some recommendations. On page 176 of her report, she provides us with some data, an excerpt of some of the data. And she said that it can be extrapolated from the data that the average incarcerated offender is one who, and this is not the entire report, just excerpts even from that section, one who displayed serious delinquency during his school years, and in many cases, 6 to 4%, was suspended or expelled more often than not for fighting and or using drugs.
Yep.
Generally had parents who did not support the school teachers and officials in their efforts to address issues involving their child. Is a born Caymanian. Began his criminal career early in his life, had appeared before the juvenile youth court, usually on criminal charges before the age of 15, and probably went to reformatory school. In 53% of the cases was a lockup as a child. Was first imprisoned as a teenager in 50% of the cases. Uses drugs, usually marijuana, but a 43% chance of cocaine use at times.
Wow.
Grew up in a dysfunctional household characterized by negative practices and patterns of behavior. Experienced parental separation, abandonment or rejection, or child abuse.
Yes.
Witnessed domestic violence. Was raised in a household where, among other things, a family member had been convicted of criminal charges and in many cases has also served prison sentences. And then in her conclusion, she goes on to say, one can therefore conclude that the determinants of crime are rooted in the life experiences of the individuals who have been arrested, convicted, and incarcerated.
Wow.
Moreover, as the study reveals, the seeds of destruction were often sown early in their youth. However, it is critical to note that when criminal risk factors are present in the life of the child, there must be appropriate early intervention if one wishes to save that individual from drifting down the path of antisocial behavior, delinquency, and ultimately into the revolving doors of the criminal justice system.
Yep.
Now, I've taken the time to read all of that, Michael, because I think that is foundational to our discussion here today. And in that data set that I read out from, these symptoms, these issues that the youth were facing as young children, as young men, they were evident to members in the society.
We all know
also,
them.
right? It's not like they were growing up in an environment where we were not seeing for ourselves.
You're right.
That this young man is slipping, he's sliding, he does not have the support system that he needs to have.
Yep.
Right? And I think that between us as a community and the government, that some apology, and I'm going to say, even I have to apologize. And I have to say to young men, I am sorry I did not play the role that I should have played in intervening in your crisis when I saw it, when it was at its smallest.
Yeah.
And now today we have issues dealing with our young men. That the magnitude of it is incomprehensible and certainly alarming to our society as a whole. But Michael, this report is not new to you.
It's not. I mean, I've read it.
And the juvenile
100
court
times.
system is not new to you.
No.
Share with us, please, and for the benefit of the viewers, your involvement in juvenile delinquency.
You know, my time really started in 1991. Coming back from college, I worked as a intern in the department. At the time, it was Department of Social Services. I graduated in 95 and I became a social worker, you know, at the age of probably 21 years old. I mean, that was my first baptism in understanding how bad the juvenile issue was at the time. We had ushered in at that time, it was called the American Marine Institute, because during the 80s, 70s and 80s, we were sending people either to Bonaventure, and when they were many of them were just overly challenging, we would then pack them up and send them off to Jamaica. And that's how, you know, the whole youth to adult transition came into effect, because we were bringing these youngsters back either from Jamaica or they were removed from Bonaventure and they were just being dumped out on the street, right? They had aged out of the system. They were now adults at 18 years old. When I came back in 95, our government had subcontracted the American Marine Institutes to do rehabilitation with many of our wayward young men. The unfortunate part about what had happened during that particular time is that when they implemented the American Marine Institute at the time, well, they dubbed it the Cayman Islands Marine Institute, CIMI, at the time. It was we did not set up the organization to become a school. What we did was we set up the organization as a dumping ground. The organization became everything to everyone. It started off as a day program for young men who were being kicked out of the public school system. They were down there 5 days a week. Then we recognized that, okay, well, we need a residential unit. So it became a day program and a residential unit. And then we figured out, well, girls are now extremely at risk. So it became a day program for girls and boys. And then they went further. Then it was, okay, well, you know, girls are further at risk. So we need to also put in a residential setting for girls too. So they had government build a residential setting. This was $1 million organization.
Wow.
We spent in a 10-year period anywhere between 12 to $15 million on the American Marine Institute. And if you try to Google the American Marine, you can't even
find it now.
Right? They were primarily out of Florida, and they were dealing with a lot of gang warfare that was happening on the streets of Florida, and we subcontracted them, and we became their biggest client, right? Because we kept on adding different parts to it, right? What they didn't do is that you had youngsters going to CIMI, and it was not listed as a school. It was not. It was really a rehabilitation program. So the average stay at the Marine Institute was anywhere between 3.5 to 4 years. So we institutionalized our children. And then when it was convenient for us, we couldn't manage them anymore. At 18 years old, they now became adults. We basically said, okay, Tina, you can now leave. And the court discharged them. Well, they came right out, right? These are the same youngsters today that are having children, right?
And repeating the cycle.
And the cycle goes on.
Yes.
So when I came back in 95 and I started to see a lot of this, I begged, at the time it was the Tower Building, which was, you know, right in the back of us. You know, I begged the director at the time to allow me to really develop a youth concept, to really get focused with us. And I felt that we needed a task force. I'd come from, my schooling was in the US, and social workers were actually taking on specific roles, right? I had the majority of what was on my caseload was elderly. Well, the elderly wasn't an issue, right? I kept on saying to our department, right? Like, these people just really need social stimulation, and that shouldn't be me. I came back to really help our people, and the help that I felt that of where I belong was really within youth. We never listened. I then transitioned. I actually then transitioned to the Marine Institute. I left government and I transitioned to the Marine Institute in probably late 1990s to work really with young people. And I felt that we could have done so much more. The first thing that I started to get to understand about the Marine Institute is that our government never licensed it as a school. So therefore, when you went down there and the kids did all of their schooling there, they never got any credit for that.
Oh my
right?
Wow.
Right? They never got a high school diploma. So we disadvantaged hundreds of children.
And then throw them in the streets.
And then when we just basically said, well, now you're 18 years old, they actually couldn't stay there. So I did the research. 80%, if not higher. I tracked well over 100 plus young people that had been sent to the Marine Institute between that and the Bonaventure home of the 70s. I tracked those people as well. I tracked them all the way to the prison system. Over 80% of the folks that stayed at the Marine Institute and before that, the old Bonaventure home, ended up in the prison system.
Wow.
Right? All we did was we delayed the inevitable. And here's a major reason why. We never, even though we got them off the street, we never provided them with the tools.
Yes, exactly.
Right, to thrive, right? We never provided them with a proper education system. We never provided them with the mental health and the alcohol and drug interventions that they need. We just felt that just simply taking them off the street and putting them in a place
for a couple of years was
good enough. And it didn't solve that problem, right? Because what we also didn't do is that just understand, what we did was we blame our children for their issues. We never held their parents accountable. Right? Very few times I went to youth court that a parent was actually held accountable for the issues of their children. We never held them accountable. Another thing that we never did was we didn't say, okay, we're going to remove Michael Myles from the home. We're going to put him in a place where he can be cared for. And then while we've extracted him, we're going to work on the home. Then when he comes home,
That's right. Yes.
the home is better. We never
Yes.
did that either.
Right.
So all of the kids that came out, and all of these were kids that came from, Watler's Road or Scranton or, like depressed areas that no one really cared. Like these weren't young men and women that came from prep school or Catholic or CIS wasn't around at the time, but no one really cared about these kids. We packing up kids and sending them off to Tranquility Bay or some other, center in Jamaica, and they came back a lot worse. We put them with hardened criminals,
Yes.
right?
And we're still doing that today, not to cut you off. We're still doing it today because we're taking these young men, and we're putting them now among the adult men in prison.
Absolutely.
And we're continuing the same cycle.
Correct.
And the reality is, Mike, for me, as I listen to you, is that you identify the areas in which the vast majority, 99.9% of these children came from.
Yeah.
And again, that was a stigma that, you know what?
Yeah.
Just leave them, just put them there,
Absolutely.
not recognizing that what you were doing was fueling these same
all it is.
individuals to come back out
Yeah.
and make havoc for you and
Yes.
everyone else.
We've
And then you keep
disadvantaged them.
blaming them
Yeah.
and the society, and we doing nothing. I mean, and this is from the government to the church
Yeah.
and
Exactly.
in between.
Everybody wants,
Exactly,
Pastor Allen, everybody wants the problem to just go away. I showed
It's
you
not gonna
this.
go away.
There's an article over the last, I don't know, 20 years, I collected articles, because for me, it was very interesting to see what our political leadership was saying. And I've worked with government probably about 14 years. I've worked in 4 different departments in government, all to do with youth, and families. My last stint in government was in the Ministry of Education between 2010 and 2017. And one of the things that I've learned quite a bit is that no one champions this, right? I told you guys before, the only other person that I am aware of over the last 30 years that championed youth intervention or social issues was Dr. Frank McField. Was the only person that actually championed it. He brought me back in 2002 to run Bonaventure, because when government changed, when elections happened, Dr. Frank, was given a ministerial role,
Right.
and he became the Minister of Youth and Culture and so forth, right, and Social Services. And he reached out to me. I had then left the Marine Institute at the time, and my family and I migrated to the U.S. And he brought me back in 2002 because he restructured the Marine Institute. What he wanted the kids to go back into the public school system, because he knew that we were failing them if they were all in one place. If every day all you saw was bad behavior in one spot, that's all you did.
Yes.
That became your behavior.
Yes.
And he knew that, based on all of his studies and so forth. And he wanted me to change that. He wanted Bonaventure to remain a home for wayward young men. And what he also instructed me to do was he wanted to ensure that rehabilitation measures were put in place. The first thing that I did within my 6 months of working at Bonaventure was we hired a full-time therapist. That's the first thing that I brought in. We hired a full-time therapist because I felt that we needed to do something in order to help families reintegrate and get their children back to reintegrate with them. We removed where youngsters were there for 3 to 4 years. I brought that down to 6 to 8 months. I worked with social workers to ensure that when we removed that child, the house came into therapy.
Yes.
It wasn't just the child, because the child was never the problem.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to
The
stop
child was the
blaming the child.
effect of the problem.
Precisely, right? So I saw a different way of doing this, and because I had the minister's backing, we were absolutely successful. But again, government changed, and we went back to warehousing children all over again. And 2007, I decided I had seen enough, because I am not going to stay in an organization and watch young people be used as political footballs for politicians who just don't really care, right?
Mike, can we look a little bit closer at how that entire structure under Dr. Frank's regime at that time actually worked and how it was interconnected. And it was referred to as the application of the therapeutic approach.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right? And it had a multidisciplinary team.
Yeah.
Sorry. And share with us some of the segments.
I think what he did that was different from what a lot of politicians have done is that he brought all of the organizations that dealt with families and children under his umbrella. So it was easy for me to contact the Department of Counseling, or at the time, I don't think it was Family Resource Center, but all of these helping agencies were under his ministry. So it was easier for me to buy into, to get services from all of these industries.
Makes
whereas
sense.
it is now, where it's very dissected, right? They're not together, they don't meet together. But he also forced a number of organizations to play ball. For instance, social workers, for example, they were forced to be their clients' advocates.
Yes.
You're not going to just dump them at Bonaventure anymore and just walk away. You actually have to now come in, ensure that we are going to reunify the child with the family. And he forced them to do a number of things. He also made the funds available, because all of a sudden, what had happened was they were giving the Marine Institute $2 or $3 million a year. And all of a sudden, we took over Bonaventure and they wanted to give us less, as if we had less issues. And he was like, no. We need to fund it the exact same way, because we're now buying more resources, right? So we recruited the people that we felt that we needed to ensure that these youngsters were taken care of. We also put in things like mental health services, right? It wasn't just therapeutic services, but Dr. Lockhart had just arrived in the country. When I was at Bonaventure, when I arrived in 2002 and took over in early 2003, one of the things that I found was that all we did was medicated the kids. That's all we did. They would come in, we kept them on the high medication, and they were zombies throughout the day. And then all of a sudden, when fights happen, no one would be there to kind of resolve some of that, because the kids were not accustomed to socializing with anyone. They were just there for so many years. Well, we did something different. I had Dr. Lockhart assess all of the students. We started taking them off of meds, and the kids went back into the school system. Another thing that he did was Dr. Frank reappointed the board. We scaled the board down, because the old board for CIMI was made up of socialites. These were folks who didn't know anything about youth development, rehabilitation. That's where I met Bonnie Anglin at the time. And when Bonnie came in, we ran the board very, very differently. And the board was run with people who actually knew what was actually happening with the students and how to buy into that, right? These weren't people that just met for the sake of meeting. It was, what are we going to do in order to ensure that the students go home? We reduced the stay. We worked with the families. We included a number of different interventions. The Yolanda Forde report, had we had listened to that in 2006, had we had implemented some of the resources that you've just read, we would not have the gang issues at this extreme. We would not have the social issues at this extreme. Just remember that when I became a social worker, there was no needs assessment unit. 50% of my job was welfare. I was doing welfare as a social worker. Today, we have two very large departments. Needs assessment unit has now become the Department of Financial Assistance. It is now a massive department. So we now have so many needs. When you look at the millions of dollars that we're now spending on those needs.
And the reality is then our youth is really not, there's absolutely nothing going or happening for these young people, except that now what we're doing is we're putting more money into policing.
Precisely. And that's exactly what we have done. I refer back to this article that was done in 2011. The leader of the opposition at the time was Mr. McLaughlin, and he said, we have a national crisis of immense proportions. This was in 2011. They're making that same statement in 2024.
This was in response to the gun violence that was happening.
Absolutely.
where
Seen
5
gun
young
violence?
men
Same,
died in
the
Absolutely.
days.
same thing,
And-
right?
Absolutely.
And what was the approach that they recommended?
More policing.
More policing.
Right? We wanted what they called for. Here's what we have. Mr. McLaughlin said the laws preventing peaceful individuals from possessing firearms or instructions or instruments for personal protection were complete and utter nonsense. So they're talking about arming regular people, right? They were talking about Mr. Bush had actually brought a motion to the board to ensure, or brought a motion to the House that ensured that the police commissioner, Mr. Beans at the time, was given more funding to create a division for simply major crime, right?
Now, that is contrary to the recommendations that had been
course.
put out
Absolutely.
5 years earlier that said if you want to address this
Yep.
issue, you need to address it with early childhood intervention.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I just, as you're saying them about, arming citizens then with gun.
Yeah.
So we're probably on the road to adopting the Florida Stand Your Ground law.
That's
and then
exactly
the
what they were doing.
easiest way to do this is just to kill,
Yes.
to shoot them.
Yes.
Well, this is only going to cause and propel more violence. So because that might sound far-fetched.
No, it's not.
It might
That's
sound
exactly what it
far-fetched,
is.
but that is exactly what that sounds like to me is, Florida has stand your ground. So if you think your life is in danger, you can shoot and kill. So let's just kill all of these young men. But this is
Ellen,
frightening.
we had politicians at the time were trying to push through the 3-strike laws.
California law.
They had no clue what they were doing. What they saw was, because everybody went into panic mode, right? They had all of these shootings, no different than the 7 people who got shot in West Bay, right? So everybody went into panic mode. So they were calling for these 3-strike laws. Bill Clinton did those in the early 90s.
And
You know what
regretted it.
happened? 90% of black and brown people were incarcerated through that law.
Yes.
They completely ripped apart communities because even if you got, if your 3rd strike was simply you driving on the road and you having a bottle open, a bottle of liquor or something open, and that was your 3rd strike, you got 50 years in prison. That's the stupidity that we are talking about here. No one talked about, okay, no child. I've never met a child, and I have dealt with hundreds, probably thousands of young people in Cayman. I've never met a child that woke up in the morning at 10 years old to say, I want to be in a gang. Or today I want to have a child at 12.
Yes.
No one does. That's not normal behavior, right?
Exactly.
And when you're looking at that 90% of black and browns being incarcerated, you have that child 10 years old waking up without his father.
That's it.
Right?
And mom.
And when you look at the statistics of the young men who's been through the system, fatherlessness is a constant,
Yes.
It is.
has a constant presence
Yeah.
in those statistics. So, Michael, we are at the end of the time for this show. But we know that you're going to stay on with us so that we can continue the discussion, and we want to invite you, our viewers and listeners, to also stay tuned for the next episode of A Good Show. Sis?
You can watch us on Cayman Live TV, Logic Channel 33 on Tuesdays and Sunday evenings at 7 p.m.
Thank you very much for joining us, and see us again next week for part 2 of Crime. Intervention is the solution.
A Good Show is brought to you by the kind donations of private sponsors like yourselves and the support of companies such as Media Warehouse, 7 Miles of Grace, H. Philippi Banks Attorney at Law, Dragonfly Cayman, and others. To become a sponsor, an advertiser, or to make a donation, email agoodshow@christian.ky. A Good